勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
Okay, now before I start the video, I think I should let you guys know that number one, I'm going without a script for this part, and number two, I'm also a bit tired, so if you guys find me not making sense at some points, just take that into consideration. Probably just my mind basically telling me to go to sleep, but I'm just trying to fight it off, so that's why I may not be making much sense, especially with no script. But beyond that, let's roll the video. Dang, it's been a long time since I did no script. But basically, what ended up happening in the last part was that Yujiro decided to take a different route with Izuku compared to his other two sons. Yujiro would have been curious as to figure out how strong this son would be if he were to actually raise them. If he was actually raised them as he was basically as a kid. He would be curious to figure out just how much more powerful Izuku could get under his own influence. He already had the genes of Yujiro, so adding in basically his own sort of training method would be an interesting sight. And over the years, Izuku would actually take on more of Yujiro's personality. Of course, this would end up messing with Inko though. She would be extremely concerned for her child and wonder what sort of monster that she had let into her house over the years. But of course, Izuku would end up becoming quite a strong individual. He would actually become strong enough to rival quirk users. And he would actually make it into UA off of his pure effort alone, out of his pure strength alone, I should say. And of course, by the time he was able to do the quirk exams, he was able to, well, it's like a quirk apprehension test, I believe that was the name of it. But Izuku was able to actually outdo most other students, despite the fact that he was quirkless. In the end, Izuku would actually stay in Class 1A while Mineta would be placed into the general course program. Aizawa would actually take on a new student though, this student being known as Satoshi Shinso. Aizawa had looked at the test. Basically, what ended up happening was that Aizawa took a look at some of the student files and realized how when it came on to this physical portion of the entrance exam, it was extremely unfair to those who were not blessed with physical quirks, essentially those that were just all destructive power. Some were more subtle in where they affected the human mind or something along those lines. Aizawa ended up coming across an individual just like him, and where it did not necessarily affect inanimate objects alongside humans, but only humans. It may not have been practical for the physical exam, but when it came on to a hero in general, that could genuinely be a very good quirk to have. He would look at Shinso and realize that, hey, this kid kind of reminds me of how I was back in the day. So Aizawa would actually take on Shinso as a sort of apprentice for Class 1A. He would have to train his body up though, since he was really lacking in comparison, especially to that one quirkless kid within the classroom. They would end up figuring out just how strong Izuku would be by the next time, or by the next day. Basically, what ended up happening was that All Might would actually be the one to be teaching the class, and he would be teaching the class about how to deal with a villain situation. Basically, when it came on to fighting villains indoors. And the best way that he seemingly could figure out a way to teach the students would be hands-on. So he would have it to where the students would act as if they were heroes and or villains. Not Aizawa, but All Might would end up getting a recommendation from Aizawa about Shinso's situation, and he would take that into account, wondering just how well the kid would do in this sort of exam. He would be paying close attention, and of course the fight would be that, well, it would be Izuku and Ochako versus Bakugo and Shinso this time around. All Might would be curious to figure out just how well each of these students would do in this sort of exam. Izuku, he would have no problem dealing with Bakugo though, simply because of the fact that Izuku, in terms of physical strength and speed, he surpassed Bakugo in those areas, on top of the fact that he did have martial arts skills. Bakugo did have his explosions though, which gave him more destructive power, you could say. Izuku would make sure to avoid those explosions, and he would make sure to knock out Bakugo as soon as possible. He was able to pin down Bakugo and do his best in order to wrap the capture tape around him. After he was done with Bakugo, he would end up following Ochako to wherever she went. He would have ended up finding Shinso guarding the bomb, and of course the boy would be surprised. He would try and communicate with the two though, hopefully trying to capture them in his mind control and basically his brainwashing quirk. Shinso would actually get the desired effect on Ochako, but not so much Izuku. Izuku wouldn't be the first one to actually speak. Well, what ended up happening instead was that Ochako was the first one to speak, talking about how he was going to be taken down. When he said, how did they actually make it here? Ochako would mention the fact that they were able to defeat Bakugo back downstairs, and that's literally right then and there. That's how Shinso was able to actually take control. He was able to brainwash her, but he failed to realize that Izuku had yet to be brainwashed though. He had yet to actually communicate with Shinso, which would annoy him. He would try and do all sorts of tactics in order to get Izuku to speak, but Izuku would simply hold his tongue, realizing that they were in a bit of a bad situation. He would shake Ochako awake though, out of Shinso's quirk. He would shake her awake, and then they would have to deal with Shinso. He would recommend that she not say anything for the rest of this match, and Ochako would oblige when she realized what ended up happening to her. When she realized what ended up happening to herself back there, all because of the fact that she had let her guard down around Shinso. She would make sure not to do that again during this match. They would end up taking down Shinso, but their class would recognize that it was basically a 2 versus 1 situation. There was no way that Shinso could really compete against these two. It was bad enough that he was dealing with Izuku, who was able to take down Bakugo, although when it came on to Izuku's fight against Bakugo, it did seem at times that Bakugo was giving the taller boy Izuku a bit of a rough paddle, basically putting him in a tight position at times, but Izuku did manage to actually beat Bakugo in the end, especially while quirkless. That's something that the students had to constantly keep in mind, the fact that Izuku was quirkless. And then they were able to see Izuku just take down Shinso as well. But the kids did genuinely feel bad for Shinso because of the fact that he seemingly had no physical sort of quirk like the others, which made the situation even worse. Even worse than it simply just being a 2-on-1. A 2-on-1 with one of his opponents being Izuku. Of course, though, they would declare Izuku the MVP simply because of the fact that he was able to use overwhelming force in order to take down each of the villains. And of course, well, they would end up seeing Todoroki's display, realizing that, okay, maybe Izuku isn't the strongest kid in this class. Izuku would see this and actually be impressed himself. He wanted to fight Todoroki now. This kid seemed strong. Incredibly strong, actually. Someone that could genuinely give him a challenge, maybe. But he would have to wait for his turn. Now, when it came on to the class presidential election, simply put, the kids would be a bit too scared of Izuku and simply go for Ida, seeing as how he was one of the safest options. He seemed to be on a more strict side, but at the same time, he was basically already seemingly a natural leader. They figured that they would be in good hands with Ida, and they would have Momo as vice president here. They were also kind of worried about Todoroki. They weren't exactly sure about everything that this kid could do. He just seemed so cold for some reason. And that wasn't meant to be a pun either. Now, when it comes on to the whole faculty thing, the whole cafeteria issues, basically it happens exactly like canon. I'm not even gonna bother with that one. Basically, all you need to know is that the news press broke into UA still, and of course the students will have a big commotion, only for Ida to eventually figure out that, hey, this is just the media here. And they would put a stop to it. They would put a stop to their actions right when they figured out that it was just media. They would calm down and just walk in a single file line from there on out. And when it comes on to USJ, the students, they would just be talking about each other's quirks and then comment on the fact that Izuku had no quirk, wondering how that was even possible, how he was just so strong. Izuku would explain who his father was, so Yujiro Hanma, the number 2 hero of Japan. He was quirkless as well, which would surprise many of the students. Some of them were theorizing that Yujiro had some sort of strength quirk back in the day as well. But to hear that Yujiro was genuinely quirkless, they all thought it was just rumors at first, but no, the fact that this was true. This meant that there really were deviants out there, a smaller part of the quirkless population that just seemed to be built different, you could say. Deviants just having an abnormal amount of strength in comparison to the average human. Not even just abnormal strength, but abnormal speed as well. They had higher potential than most regular humans, most quirkless people. And they would be impressed. They would be impressed because of the fact that they were actually seeing what a deviant could really do. They could really actually put up a match against quirked individuals, especially ones like Bakugo, who had an explosion quirk for crying out loud. The kids were all making their bets about who was now the strongest in Class 1A. with most going with Todoroki though, considering what he was able to do to that one building. He literally froze it over. They didn't think that Izuku had it in him to actually freeze an entire building. Well, more so, not necessarily freeze an entire building, but to actually, crumble an entire building, do something that's remotely comparable to what Todoroki was capable of doing. But Izuku would plan on getting stronger. From the event, he would plan on proving the kids wrong, proving that he was indeed the strongest of them all. Once they reached the USJ, they would end up discovering something, that there were actual villains there. The students would try to run, but Kiriguri, they would actually teleport most of the students to different locations. Izuku would be one of the few who was able to avoid getting teleported though, or should I say warped. Izuku would actually end up dealing with some other villains that were at the entrance. He would try to take down as many as possible alongside Aizawa. Aizawa would mention the fact that this was a dangerous situation that Izuku was in. Izuku would simply smile, saying that he knew and he enjoyed the thrill of the fight. He enjoyed every last moment of it. He wasn't about to just have Aizawa take all the fun. He wasn't about to let Aizawa have all of the fun, after all. So Izuku would simply take down as many villains as possible, while Aizawa was simply rolling his eyes and trying to apprehend as many as possible too. Eventually the Nomu would end up stepping in. Izuku, although strong, he wasn't strong enough to actually fight off against the Nomu. He was able to hold it back for a little bit, seemingly just being too fast for it to grab, but that was about it. Izuku wasn't really able to harm the creature or anything. Izuku would be curious as to just what kind of creature this was. He realized now that this world really was a bigger place than he once thought. The world was quite grand in terms of just how powerful a person could be, and from what he heard from one of the villains, this creature was specifically designed in order to defeat All Might. Izuku would realize now that he needed to up his ante if he really wanted to become one of the greatest to ever live. And in order to actually reach his farthest levels of strength, it would take far longer than just a couple of years. Izuku would do his best in order to spare some time by trying to take down as many villains as possible while still avoiding the Nomu. Aizawa would try to defend Izuku, but in the end, Aizawa would end up taking several I don't even know what to call this, but basically the Nomu would just grab Aizawa's head and he would slam his face into the ground multiple times over. Izuku would try to help his teacher, but the Nomu would fling him away. Izuku's nose would have been busted, and of course he would have been bleeding as well, but he would get back up, refusing to stay down. The villains, more specifically the one with the hands, Shigaraki, he would be laughing at this scene, thinking that this kid seemingly had a death wish. But Izuku would try his very best in the end, still failing. All Might would eventually arrive though, after Ida was able to escape, and they would actually be able to go against the Nomu. All Might, that is. All Might would actually be able to fight off against the Nomu for a great amount of time. Eventually he would be able to overpower the Nomu's shock absorption and regeneration. He would have overloaded the shock absorption. And he would also be able to finally land enough blows in order to overpower its regeneration as well, which meant that he was able to basically apprehend the creature in the very end. Shigaraki would mention the fact that this was an unfair game, that the heroes actually cheated. There was no way that he was just going to back down now. He figured that he could still kill All Might if he really had to. He would do it with his own hands here. He would try to run after All Might with his hand stretched out, hoping to decay the man, but Izuku would grab his arm instead, breaking it. Izuku would have been breathing heavily after getting injured from the Nomu, but Izuku would make sure that Shigaraki would at least feel some of his pain. Of course, though, Shigaraki would end up escaping in the end. Shigaraki would have been absolutely livid, especially when he got shot through the knees as well from Snipe when he tried escaping. He was wondering just how bad the situation could have been. Well, more so, if there could have been anything he could have done to have actually made the situation somewhat better for himself. But All For One would mention that this was just an unprecedented event. Basically, this wasn't something that was to be expected at all. But All For One would mention how he wanted to keep a closer eye on this one kid. This one kid, considering the fact that they seemingly may have had One For All. This kid may actually be the next successor to One For All. And considering the fact that this kid was mentioned to have an incredible amount of strength and durability, according to Tomura. But for right now, they would just have to focus on something else. Izuku's group would be at UA after the whole situation, and they would be discussing the fact that they actually fought villains. This would have actually been 2 weeks after, though. They would have had 2 weeks off of school, and when they actually arrived back to school, they would have had a lot more press. But the students, they would be talking more so about the fact that they had actually fought villains. When it came on to Shinso and Tsuyu, well, Shinso actually got teleported to the downpour zone alongside Tsuyu. What ended up happening there was that, well, Shinso basically used this quirk on multiple individuals at once. It was a bit of a strain at first for Shinso, considering the fact that it was like a whole group, not just like 2, 3, 4, but like 10 villains basically he had to control at once. But in the end, they were able to survive. They were able to swim away from the villains after Shinso was able to brainwash them. And to simply put, he realized that his brainwashing could use a bit of work. He could probably develop it a bit more to become stronger when it came onto crowds. He realized now that when it came onto his quirk, there were actual ways to improve it from here on out. This would be something that he would be investing in for a little while. When it came on to Tsuyu, she would have just been happy about the fact that she was able to live here. And Izuku would just mention the fact that he actually fought some villains as well. He even fought a villain that was meant to defeat All Might. Although he wasn't able to actually win against it, he was able to actually be fast enough to avoid its attacks. Well, most of its attacks. Izuku would use that as his sort of bragging moment while Bakugo would try and measure himself up against Izuku, mentioning the fact that he also fought his fair amount of villains, that Izuku wasn't all that special. But everybody would grow silent when they heard the door open and they would see what looked like a mummy. Basically, it would have just been Shota Aizawa. Shota Aizawa just covered in a bunch of bandages, thanks to Recovery Girl. Aizawa would mention the fact that Recovery Girl did go a bit overboard with the bandages, but he would be okay for now. The students would be hesitant of believing that, but Aizawa would mention the fact that the kids had something else to be concerned about, that being, of course, the UA Sports Festival. Basically, what would be happening there is that the kids would have to compete against each other in order to see who will be at the very top. And it was basically also to show that UA was basically still a very high rated school. UA would usually use the sports festival in order to show just how much more capable the hero students of class 1A and B, or like 2A, 2B, or 3. You get the point. Basically trying to show how the hero students were very capable of themselves from a very early age, and that their teaching methods were sound. But with recent times, they really needed the sports festival in order to prove that. The kids would be hesitant about this at first, but they would be all up for it in the end, because of the fact that they still wanted to participate in the sports festival, though some of them did believe that it should have been at least taken back a couple more weeks. Some wanted it to be cancelled in general, but they understood that UA did technically need it in the end in order to actually, save face in front of the public after they found out that some villains managed to trespass into USJ, and some kids actually had to fight them as well. The first years had to fight villains. Of course, this would have been some bad press, but Aizawa would mention how he was expecting for them to do their very best, and that there was going to be a good amount of other students there trying to surpass class 1A, so he would recommend that they go plus ultra during this event. The students would even see their peers as well, just surrounding the hallway, looking through their door, trying to get a read on each one of the students. Bakugo and Izuku would simply walk through the crowd, though, not really caring about what these kids had to look at. And they would make their way through, and many of the students would mention how these two are jerks, but Izuku would simply wave them off, saying, thank you, yes, I know I am." He was just sarcastic like that, you could say, which would just enrage some of the students as well, especially people like Mineta, who were in the general course. After the first day at UA, he should have been in class 1A. He should have been in Izuku's position. He should have been with all other ladies and all of that. But no, a quirkless kid like Izuku just had to weasel his way into the class and show himself to somehow be superior to a quirked individual like Mineta. It didn't make much sense to Mineta at first, but right now, Mineta still believed that he was treated unfairly by Aizawa. So what he planned on doing during the sports festival was actually do his utmost in order to prove that he was actually capable of making it into the hero course. Not just that, but he was worthy of being part of the hero course, and that Aizawa made a mistake. That's what I meant to be saying. So that's basically how it goes. What ends up happening in the sports festival is that, the announcement would be made. I think I forgot who actually did have first place here. I think it was maybe Izuku. So Izuku would end up giving a speech similar to that of Bakugo, simply saying that he would win. And of course, the students in their different classes, they would all be enraged hearing that. They would talk about how cocky Class 1A was, and that they would make sure to bring them down a pedestal by during the sports festival, especially during the obstacle course. And they would do no such thing, simply because of the fact that some of the individuals within Class 1A were just built completely different from the others. Izuku being one of them. He wouldn't have a flashy quake or anything, so he wasn't able to fly in the air or like just slide on the ground like Todoroki and Bakugo. But what Izuku could do though was smash some robots. He was able to actually take on some of the plating from one of the robots and use that as his own sort of sled for later on. He would have had no problem. He would have had no problem with the tightrope or like the pillars. He would just use the pillars as some sort of leapfrog. He would literally just be playing leapfrog with the pillars. It would be an hilarious sight in some other heroes' eyes, realizing that Izuku did have some humor to him, even during an event so serious like this one. But when it came on to like the mines and all of that, Izuku would use his plates and his plate in order to actually just make it to the other side. He would do something similar to in canon, where he would be digging up most of the mines and just slam the plate onto it. He would actually make it to first place from there on. And of course, Bakugo would be absolutely livid and thinking that he deserved first place, not Izuku. When it came on to the next part of the exam, I genuinely forgot the name of this exam, but basically, basically the whole thing with the horses, basically that part would just revolve around Izuku trying to defend himself from the others and trying to keep the 10 million point headband, and in the end he actually would manage to keep it because of the fact that he was just that good and his reflexes were impeccable. That another thing that should be mentioned is the fact that Izuku did end up taking some other kids' headbands, and he would have swapped his headband with some others during the time as well. He would have made sure to keep one of the headbands at the very top around his forehead, make it seem as if that was the 10 million head point band, but on a closer look, some people would realize, no, that's just like 1,000 points or something along those lines. Not necessarily a 10 million point headband. It was missing a couple of zeros, and that's what Todoroki would have realized at the last moment. He would have ticked in disappointment, and when it comes on to that, Izuku would just get first place. When it comes on to the tournament aspect though, this would be where Izuku would dominate, since he already knew how some of his opponents would. It's just that he had to be faster than them. That's literally all it was when it came on to certain fights. Okay, so basically when it came on to Shinso versus Izuku, you guys already know who would win that situation. Izuku would just keep quiet during that situation, and of course Shinso would not be capable of competing against Izuku physically, so in the end Shinso would lose. When it came on to Izuku's fight against Todoroki, this would basically be Izuku making sure he was fast enough to reach Todoroki before he was even able to use his ice or make a big enough glacier to trap Izuku, because Izuku was aware of his capabilities. If he were to let Todoroki generate his ice right then and there, then it would just spell bad news for Izuku. He wouldn't be capable of breaking out of Todoroki's ice at this current level of strength. But he planned on eventually reaching that level of strength later on in his life. It's just that he wasn't there just yet. Now Izuku would actually punch Todoroki out of the ring right then and there, and when it came on to the Bakugo fight, it would just be another L in Bakugo's book. No, well, at least that's basically how Izuku thought it would have been going. Instead, Bakugo would actually surprise Izuku with his use of Howitzer Impact. This would have been something that Izuku was incapable of avoiding, and in the end, Izuku would be charred. He would have actually been defeated by Bakugo here. Bakugo would actually be proud of himself here, because of the fact that he was able to take down this quirkless loser. After all of these years, he finally proved himself to be above Izuku, and now he felt as if there was nothing more. He had a feeling that Izuku would come back though. He had a feeling that Izuku would come back in order to challenge his new throne. And Bakugo, he would welcome the challenge. Anyways, that's basically where I'm going to leave it. When it comes on to the whole hero naming system and all of that, yeah, it's pretty much similar to in canon, just as Izuku has a bunch of more votes here. Not the same amount as Todoroki, thanks to his father's influence. And when it comes down to Izuku's father, though, although Yujiro's like the number 2 hero of Japan, it's basically like he goes in and out with Endeavor from time to time, and Endeavor would actually make more connections than Yujiro. So overall, people just saw Endeavor in a better light than Yujiro, so that's why he was able to get more votes than Izuku, Todoroki that is, I'm speaking of. Another thing that I should mention is the fact that heroes did find out that Izuku was quirkless, so a lot of them would actually be deterred from selecting Izuku as a candidate to actually intern with. But in the end, when it comes on to heroes, Izuku would just go with his father. And another thing that Izuku would actually do too was, of course, his naming thing. He would actually go on to name himself something that I don't care about. Izuku would name himself the Ground Zero or something along those lines here. Just some sort of name. He wasn't really concerned with the naming system of heroes at all. It was just some sort of formality, you could say. But Izuku just cared about strength at the end of the day. And that's how I'm going to basically end this video for right now, people. It is your boy King Ty Next signing out. Peace.